Let's take a look at some of the stories inside the papers. Jason Reid is the head of global projects at Young Voices, who joins me to do that. Jason, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
We've just been hearing from George about what we sort of learnt day one of the COVID inquiry, and the Times has got some really fascinating reporting and insight into sort of what we learnt on pages 12 and 11. It says the analysis here is that Brexit took the minister's focus off the virus threat. Who's come to that conclusion?
Well, it sounds like it's coming from Hugo Keith, the lead lawyer in the case, who is there to give impartial advice to the inquiry. And so it's not looking good for anyone in government, past or present, when literally on day one, his position seems to be that the government was making it up as they went along. They were completely unprepared. They had no idea what they were doing in this situation. Of course, it's hard to think back maybe to 2019. It seems like a very long time ago, but Brexit completely dominated the political agenda. It was all that anybody was talking about. And of course, perhaps if we'd known that there was going to be a viral pandemic just a few months later, we would have prepared for a little bit more. But as things stand, it seems like the COVID inquiry is going to shed a lot of light on just how unprepared the government was. And I hope the lesson we will learn from all this is that we cannot ever afford a repeat of what happened in 2020 and 2021, with us giving the government such a wide berth to invoke all kinds of unprecedented powers as a sort of knee-jerk reaction when we knew very little of what was going on. And of course, the Times has its diagram as well of all the different quangos and organizations and groups that were accountable to each other to do with health regulation in this country. It's staggering to look at the sheer volume of them: advisory groups and resilience groups and health protection research units and so many others who clearly have their remits overlapping. A total mess of bureaucracy. It's hard to come up with a system that would have been less well equipped to deal with a novel virus pandemic than this. And so it seems like we got the worst of both worlds. And that's why I think it's so essential that the inquiry is doing this intensive post-mortem, as painful as it will be for many people, to work out what on earth happened and how on earth we can avoid it in the future.
Yeah, you mentioned that diagram, Jason. It's really hard to kind of describe the complexity of it. You've got a kind of a spider diagram that's got bodies that you'd expect on it, like the Department for Health and Social Care, the Cabinet Office, SAGE. But it is this mass web of about 45 or 50 different bodies with different arrows flying from one part to the other. And this is supposed to be our government's sort of pandemic preparedness and response structure. Do you think there's some sort of level of embarrassment from the government that it comes to light now? Well, look, this is how we prepared before a pandemic, and what it looks like, and from the government's, from Hugo Keith, vastly underprepared.
I think there is embarrassment in the government, and rightly so, because this situation is completely absurd, and it had all kinds of horrendous consequences, which I think we probably won't fully understand for decades to come, whether it's the health consequences or education or mental health or the economy. It's going to take such a long time to unpick all the consequences of this complete disaster that came from this regulatory mess. I think we live in an age of quangocracy, where the instinct for government, anytime it comes across a problem that doesn't quite know how to solve, is, oh, we'll appoint a new group to deal with that. We'll delegate that responsibility to somebody else. And so you just end up with this never-ending mess of different organizations that are accountable to each other somehow in a very complex way that nobody really understands, that is not at all equipped to deal with any kind of crisis, especially a once-in-a-century crisis like a pandemic. And that was what resulted in that mess. And that's why this inquiry is going to be so difficult to hear for so many people.
And lots of concern about just quite how long the inquiry might be, because our sort of history with inquiries is they can be so lengthy that sort of the immediacy and people remembering and wanting to learn the lessons from it kind of don't feel relevant when we actually get the results. Let's move on, shall we? The comment pages in the Times here. Daniel Finkelstein is writing, and he says, Boris Johnson's departure opens a door for Rishi Sunak. Why so?
Well, Rishi Sunak, before this latest explosion of the row with Boris Johnson, he was in a difficult position because he had to tread a fine line with Boris, because Boris wasn't in government, of course. He's not the Prime Minister anymore, but he was also still in the party. He was still lurking on the back benches. And so he sort of had to pretend to be friends with him. But because Boris has so spectacularly blown up his own political career in the last few days with his knee-jerk, I think, resignation from his parliamentary seat, it makes life quite a bit easier for Rishi Sunak as he's heading into the election, because he's able now to draw a line between the last 13 years of Tory government and himself. And that's ultimately what he needs to do if he's going to have any chance of making a case to the electorate that he should get another 5 years in government. If he's just asking for another term of Tory government, that's going to be a very, very difficult case to make. So he needs to ask for the first term of Rishi government. He needs to seem like he's presenting something new. And Boris Johnson, when it comes to economics, which is the top issue for most voters at the moment, is not someone who is seen as responsible. He's seen as a big spender, someone who wants to cut taxes, someone who's maybe a little bit of a different brand of politician than Rishi Sunak is. And of course, Rishi Sunak wants to be able to attack Labour on those grounds, no matter who the Labour leader is, whether it's Corbyn or Starmer. He wants to be able to criticise Labour for being economically irresponsible, for throwing about your money here and there. And it's much easier for him to do that when Boris Johnson is out of the picture and he can present himself as the responsible politician he wants to be. So I think Rishi Sunak overall, although it might have been a bit stressful in the last few days, will probably be quite happy with the way this has turned out.
Stressful to say the least. And we've actually, we heard sort of Rishi Sunak come out fighting a little bit. We saw some of that with him when it was the leadership campaign against Liz Truss, but then he's been very cautious, and that sort of changed style a little bit with the sort of rhetoric with Boris Johnson. So maybe this does sort of draw a line and it's a new opportunity for him. One thing that will appease quite a lot of people is that the police are going to get powers to tackle slow-walking protests by Just Stop Oil. Who's going to be celebrating this, Jason?
Well, I'll be celebrating it for one. I think this is long overdue. I can't believe it took this long, to be honest with you, when you've got protesters who quite routinely are very obviously looking to disrupt people's lives, to stand in the middle of the road if they're walking very slowly and get in the way of people going about their law-abiding business, doing whatever important tasks that the protesters have no idea what they might be doing. They don't seem to care about that. And so finally, at long last, the police are going to have the powers they need, according to their own discretion, to tackle these protests. It is very frustrating when you see footage of these protests taking place and the police seem to be spectators. They seem to just be watching on and not helping people go about their lives as they have the right to do. And so I think this is long overdue. It's very, very sensible. And I can't believe it hadn't happened already, to be honest.
Jason, the paper does also say the average time it takes for the police to remove slow-walking protesters is between 13 to 19 minutes. Is it that much of an inconvenience?
I tell you what, I'm sure it feels like a lot longer than that when you're stuck in a stationary car and it's, you've got somewhere to be, somewhere important. Maybe you're taking people to hospital, or even if it's something more every day. We can't just be allowing people a blank check to do whatever they want to do just because they think they're politically right. Just Stop Oil, I think it's fair to say, are an extremist group by any definition. They seem to be frustrated that the government isn't dropping everything in order to implement their very extreme radical agenda. And it seems that they're making clear the message they're sending is we are not going to stop until we get what we want, and we're just going to keep accelerating our protests.
Just to put the other side, though, Jason, if you want to protest right now and you need to cause some kind of disruption, what are your options?
You can protest in all kinds of ways. It's very easy in the modern age to get your voice heard, to get your message out there. The problem with groups like Just Stop Oil is that they're not content with having their voice heard. They can't believe that anybody sees the world differently to them. They can't believe that people want different things from politicians than they do. And so they seem to be acting out of frustration, out of exasperation, in a very irrational way, just trying to cause maximum disruption. And I don't think that's the way things should work in a democracy. We all vote at the ballot box. They, of course, have free speech to do whatever they want to do, as long as it isn't interrupting other people's lives, which seems to be their only focus at the moment, more than their actual message.
Let me know what you think. You can text me as well, 87222. Start your message with the word Times. Now, Jason, I wonder if we could resurrect this band.
Oh, I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends.
We always hear about the gloom about AI, but Jason, it could be that AI means we could hear some new music from the Beatles.
It does. I think this is absolutely fantastic. This just goes to show the wonders of innovation in the free market, that we can use technology like this to create things that we never thought we would hear again. I think that something like AI is going to transform our lives and transform society in ways that we can't even imagine right now. And you're always going to get a bit of fear mongering. You're always going to get people who are scared. That's been the case with every major technological development that's ever happened, whether it's the internet or going back further, something as simple as the bicycle. People thought there would be all kinds of health disasters and it was going to be the end of humanity one way or another, and it never quite materializes. I don't buy into the doom mongering at all. Maybe I'm just a bit too optimistic on this Wednesday morning, but I just think this is fantastic. And if you'd said to somebody just 50 years ago that this was going to be a possibility, you'd have blown their minds. And so we should be celebrating it as much as we can.
Yeah, so we're going to have next year a final Beatles song that's going to see the light of day, because producers managed to extricate Lennon's voice with a little help from artificial intelligence from what was this very ropey recording. So, well, we'll find out. Apparently it's an apologetic love song. So coming to radio stations near you in the next year. Jason, thank you so much. Jason Reed is the head of Global Projects for Young Voices, going through the papers with me this morning.